Okay, now we enter part 2 on this, and Mr. Imhotep being debunked again about, well, every video he makes can easily be done in such a way. You can see behind the guy that's here on the right, which is an Egyptian who was a doctor and decided to become a comedian and so on. And he's been one of the ones outspoken on the Cleopatra thing. And of course, the idea, he's defending the fact that it wasn't Egyptians, it was Macedonian Greek, and Cleopatra couldn't have been a Bantu in any way, shape, or form, much less when you show all the Egyptians as being Bantus, and even Ptolemy. It's real self-exposing, and much worse when you actually try to say, well, they might have been Bantu somehow. And it's like, well, no, the Bantu didn't even know Egypt existed, and everybody's well aware of that. So he presents this picture here of Yusuf on the right, which looks very much like Perenefer, who is the seated scribe that they couldn't name for years, but after going through it all, they pretty much singled it down and figured out it was Perenefer. He's also shown with those crystal blue eyes that he shows here, but he wants to compare it to an ambiguous statue. If you've seen any of the other videos on this, they try to take the well-known statues that can be named and they're part of the Egyptian nobility and claim that they're just random. But then this broke off the nose random might actually have a Negroid phenotype if you put a different type of nose on it. This picture on the left here was supposed to be Menez or Narmer, and they went with Menez, and of course it's one that was just found in a Cairo market. It wasn't found in situ, hooked up to anything else, and people made the idea, well, this might be as old. Weird thing about that is that picture on the left is all spread out. They put it in a program and spread the face out wide, so it made the nose wider and everything else on that. So this ambiguous statue should be the one versus the real Egyptians that are over here on the right. Now, I'll show you here in a shortly how they've said that the modern Egyptians are more closely related to European people than the current population of Egypt, so they only have a 1% connection, mainly in the Coptics, and probably people like this, to the ancient Egyptians. So it shows a radical difference in the two of those things. But as far as Bantu ever knowing Egypt existed, that never happened. But that's a dream that they have, and they want to discount everything that's been shown. He even mentions the fact that he made a video going through all the genetics that they show, but he didn't. Just to the right shoulder over in here, you can see there are haplogroups that are mentioned: U, M1A1, J2R, and different haplogroups that are mentioned as being part of the ancient Egyptians. There's not a Bantu one there, and there's certainly not a Nubian type or anything like that that's been shown that show up in that. If it did, I think you'd find that just like in the Bantu people, whenever they show up one that does match, like E1B1, this is actually somebody who's been admixed, and to the point that they take over the haplogroup of some people that admix them and not theirself. It's simple to state it this way, that E is derived from Eurasian CT, which is where Eurasian atom comes from, and that if anything showed up with E, they'd have to be connected to these people. There's not any way that you would possibly magically pop up over here with E1B genetics and not be related to the people just north of you in North Africa that have always had that E1B1 genetics and are hooked up to the Eurasian CT, backflow, all kinds of things that I've shown in other videos. Let's continue on with what he says here.
Let's take a look. 2017 Abu Sir El Melek. The third one occurred in 2017, when a highly publicized study emerged as a landmark in the field of ancient Egyptian research. The study involved the extraction of DNA from 150 mummies found in the city of Abu Sir El Melek, located in Middle Egypt. These mummies span from the late New Kingdom to the Greco-Roman period, providing a comprehensive timeline of ancient Egyptian history.
So what this actually covered was from that ancient time all the way through Roman times, And seriously, what they were kind of looking for, if there was any integration from the other people, such as the Persians, the Hyksos, and so on, that would change any of the genetics as it went through. And what they found is they had a continuity all the way through it and did not change, especially in the nobility. One can understand that whenever they would even go to the point of inbreeding with each other to keep from that happening. So it should be something that's easily noted. And then if you find somebody that's more of a Negroid that aren't even allowed into Egypt, as the Nubians weren't allowed into Egypt by well-known decrees, then it makes even more sense that there's no possibility of that. But they keep trying to insinuate that there are these possibilities. Well, who's doing this? Bantu type people from West Sub-Saharan Africa in the Congo jungle area where they came from. Well, those people aren't related even to the Nubians or anybody in the Horn or East Africans or anybody else in the world. Actually, they show a 19% unknown ghost hominid in their genetics that no one else in the world has. So when they keep trying to say, we were the original, we were this, we were that, they were not, they were not, they were not. And they want to try to accept anybody else's history except for their own, and that's really self-exposing. Let's continue on here.
Contrary to the previous mummies, these were not royal mummies, but some random inhabitants of the area of unknown origin.
Now he tries to pull that random thing again, like, well, we're not too sure. Let me tell you that all of the Egyptologists and archaeologists and so on are well versed in this and know that, yeah, those aren't just random people. Those are the real Egyptians. And are they nobility? No, we're not taking the ones from nobility, although that's on the list too, because we have quite a few of them. Here we're showing the showing of King Tut's DNA. And from what I understand, somebody who used the exact same software and the machines that they used to detect it. Now, Zayiwa said he was going to tell it what it was and his haplogroup and the things about it, but they didn't. He just tried to say, well, the ancient Egyptians are the modern Egyptians, which is kind of hilariously sad because when the geneticists got a hold of it, they go, well, they've got a 1% connection, only that small, to the ancient Egyptians. Well, who does have a major connection to the ancient Egyptians? Well, it's Caucasians, and it's Caucasians that actually live in Western European places now. We'll look at that real quick and come back. One could simply look at some of the papers here. So apparently they want to discount all of this and all of science because of feelings. But here's a paper that clearly states ancient Egyptians are more closely related to Europeans than modern Egyptian scientists claim. Yeah, so whenever they mention in the Abu Sir Melik thing that they're related to ancient Anatolians and modern Europeans, that shows you where modern Europeans used to be at. People that have that same genetics, but it also shows you who they're most connected to. There are other papers that came out and said, well, after post-Roman times, the people there started getting a Negroid admix from being involved in the slave trade, and that is a swath ran across them, along with Arab interjections, and in doing so, they ended up losing their connection to the ancients. That's quite telling, isn't it? So there are more papers than just this one that I show you here. Ancient Egyptians are more closely related to Europeans than modern Egyptians. But let's look at something else that's even more revealing. So in Egyptologist's debunk of King's monologue, she was able to find the paper he tried to use to try to say, oh, they were black, they were black. And she pulled it up, and actually they explained that Neolithic Egyptians were Nordics and Mediterraneans. Let's look at that info here. Because they're connected to a people, just like Western Europeans are, of a Nordic people. They tell you here in the population fluctuation for over 7,000 years in Egypt, shown right there, population fluctuations in Egypt over 7,000 years, that this flaxen-haired white race furnished the hypsidotocephalic element which entered Egypt before the Badarian period. As I've said repeatedly, from the pre-dynastic on. We can find Ginger, the blonde-haired pre-dynastic money, but I'm guessing if you check his skull shape, then he's going to be one of those hypsidocephalic skulls that go on there. Flaxen-haired, a lot of blonde people. Well, a lot of people were shaving their heads and wearing wigs and stuff at the time. Cattle brought lice and all kinds of other things to where they did that, and to keep themselves rich and clean, they did that, along with the priest class, who would shave themselves twice a day in this endeavor. So showing you here that this flaxen-haired white race furnished this, and that they were the people that were in the nobility of ancient Egypt. His source, remember that, tried to put this out here. How contradicting to his narrative it is. And you know exactly why he hid this source from the audience, is because he tried to use some source that was going to show something over and above, that there's a Nordic type people in here. They talk about it in the papers, and again I have to mention this was all well known before World War II and agreed upon by everybody that looked at the information. But after World War II, it kind of became a little bit ambiguous, and then in a modern day they keep trying to say, well, the old Egyptians are the modern Egyptians. Well, somewhat, with some admix and some Arab influx and so on too. So let's just look on a chart. Who's the closest related in modern day? Well, modern West Europeans are the closest related to these people in ancient times. Now we have to mention here too that there was a major component of a Mediterranean type people, and who was ruling over them appeared to be this flaxen-haired white race, so on. They tell you the parallelism between dilocephaly and orthocephaly down the corridors of historic time leaves no question but that the fundamental skull characteristic of the Egyptian population, and therefore the brown or Mediterranean race, and by brown we mean slightly tan. We're not trying to get it brown, but of course whenever blacks see this, they, oh, brown, no, that's us. No, that's not you. You were in far western sub-Saharan Africa and didn't even know any of this existed. But they tell you here lower on it that this is an indigenous orthodicel headed people, long-headed and so on. And that's Caucasians too, as all of North Africa was. Of course, they don't like that reality there because that ruins their narrative right off the bat too. So their narrative gets ruined and ruined and ruined and ruined and ruined, and they still strut around like they did something, which is so self-exposing. And then they tell you again that that's what started ancient Egypt, from the pre-dynastic into it, and it went some flippy-flop through the middle kingdoms and so on like that. But at the period of the new empire, or new kingdom, dynasty 18 and Securin, so the ones that are after, however, the brachiocephals returned to their previous force, and we find population samples reminiscent of the early dynastic period in respect to that. So they ended up gaining it back again, and of course this is in the time of King Tut, Akhenaten and so on, Ramses and things. And if you look there, you can find Thuya and Yuya. You know, you can find all these blonde-haired and red-headed mummies, along with this idea of Ramses, who's been proven to have been a redhead in his early ages and stuff. So if you think it falls apart for him around the time of Cleopatra, well, they didn't think that it did. They tried to interject Cleopatra as a Bantu somehow, whenever she's actually a Macedonian Greek directly. But if we draw it back from that, when was it happened that Bantu or even black people were ever in Egypt? And it comes about as being never. Oh, people talk about the 25th dynasty. Look, from pre-dynastic -4 all the way up through +24 are these people that they're talking about. And it had a Nordic component to it. Unaffected by thousands of years by any influence foreign to their country. And Nubians weren't even allowed into the country at that time. So this definitely shows you that, and doesn't allow for any ambiguity to the situation. But blacks real desperately want to try to pretend that they were the people that were in ancient Egypt, not the Caucasians that we know. And in the process, they actually exposed the fact that it was Nordics that were running it. We've got their bones, their skeletons, their genetics, their everything, and it's all proving out to a fact that that's the way that it worked. It didn't work any other way. So again, now desperately, he's going to try to go against all science and anthropology whatsoever and claim that Bantu were somehow in Egypt they didn't know existed. What's being shown in this video is that there was a Nordic type, blonde, red-haired people that were ruling Egypt and in the nobility. And of course, after series and generations of having many kids, I mean, Ramses had over 100 children, that this, of course, would spread out. Not everybody gets to be the prince and the next king, and therefore they spread out in that ecology that's there in ancient Egypt, and would have covered a swath much bigger than we're willing to give credit for at this time. Here's a point where I mentioned that there's a giant necropolis that they've been digging out through Brigham Young University for over 20 years now. It's known as the Graveyard of Millions because there's been over 1 million people buried in this area. And the strange thing is they find that people are separated by hair color. Redheads and blondes are over here, and darker headed people are separated over there. Pretty crazy when you find that out, whenever you know that my cousin was redhead, but his mom and dad aren't, or this, that, and the other, and so on. And then they ended up having a redhead. Makes you wonder how that all happened. Well, they are both carriers of the gene, but neither one were expressing it. Things like this have to happen through that type of thing, so it's not something that can be questioned, really. So he's got all these points that he wants to bring out about anthropology, and he says he wants to cover all of his arguments for better understanding. Be sure to stick around until the end. Well, y'all stick around too, and if this goes to a part 3, it'll be in your top left-hand corner. So he's trying to pick apart somebody who really, at best of my knowledge, knows something about Egypt and wants to use that versus real things. Where this guy is trying to write off the kid saying there were Egyptians that look like this, and they're trying to write it off and say, no, maybe it was more like this, maybe it was more like this. And this guy here seemingly somewhat ambiguous to the situation.
Carried the R1A haplogroup associated with modern-day European populations. Yes.
Now, he mentioned R1A, and we talked about this in the first one. It's actually R1B, and if you want to be more specific, it's haplogroup M269 that comes out of that. Now, I did another recent video showing you that these people had M269 in the Proto Indo Europeans and way up above the Black Sea area, so that's direct. And then also, that's all in Western Europe at this time. They took and put out a thing to see who ends up being close to King Tut, but you have to have like 16 markers in R1B to end up getting M269. They're exact. And they found a kid that looked kind of like that vampire kissing guy's maybe goofy younger brother. Of course, the picture was taken whenever he was smiling oddly with everybody giving him a bunch of attention, but he looked like he had blonde hair, especially more blonde in his youth time. But so they talk about this was the case for Tutankhamun. Well, he's mistaken here, and he wants to try to point it out like he can show something, but in reality, he said R1A, and it's actually R1B. What's the difference of that? Not much, and we're still pointing out a Nordic type people. Whoops.
That was the case for Pharaoh Tutankhamun, but we've got to remember that Egypt has had a variety of dynasties that have ruled over the civilization, and we have minimal examples of what haplogroups were prevalent within each dynasty. We know from Tutankhamun that R1A was present.
R1B.
However, from Ramses III, we know that E1 was present, which is a haplogroup associated with native populations within Africa.
Yeah, mainly the Berbers contained it, and then, of course, due to admix in Congoids, they end up getting it later. Again, you don't get E out of nowhere, pop up like popcorn, and you sure wouldn't get something that's exactly like all these white people over here, but it's R1B1B. You get that far down a trail, and then it pulls it off as being, oh, it's exactly like this, but, oh, no, that doesn't work. It's sad to attempt to make it work.
What I'm trying to say is that to say Egypt was white or black in race doesn't make much sense.
Egypt was Caucasians, and it makes a whole lot of sense. And they didn't allow any of the Nubians, which aren't related to any Bantu or anything whatsoever. They aren't related to Khoisan and so on like that. That those weren't the people that were the Egyptians. In fact, whenever they had their dynasty, they call it the Nubian dynasty. They don't call it more Egyptians for a damn good reason. Let's continue.
It was a great civilization with a large population, geographically positioned to neighbor a variety of regions with very different looking people. So different looking people are going to be migrating in and mixing with the population.
Videos in which I discuss all known studies related to the ancient Egyptian populations.
Actually, he just tries to discount real science and then put out his feelings there and then turn around and say Bantu. And that is real self-exposing.
When in 2020, their Y chromosome was examined, revealing an affiliation with the R1b haplogroup, which has its roots in West Asia and is today the most common in Western Europe.
Look how common it is over there. Now, I did another recent video where I showed you the expanse of R1 haplogroup, but what they did was they said, well, we have ancient specimens of these people way over here to the east of this and down into Africa more and other places. So this is showing you the breadth of where these people with R1b genetics had gone, and that's pretty telling. But it's also extremely telling to say that right over here in Western Europe, there's a stronger amount of people, 60-70%. We get above 80% level in what we call Ireland, Scotland, and England today that match the ancient Egyptians' DNA. Now, let's see what he tries to write that off with.
But contrary to what has been spread, both results are not incompatible, since R1b is still present in Africa, notably among Central Africans in Chad and Cameroon.
This is from Admix too, but this is known as V88, and it's totally different than King Tut's or anyone else's. And again, you don't get to like, well, my haplogroup is Z. Well, all of a sudden there are these people over here that are Oriental that have Z. Then that shows you that those Oriental people had integration from Caucasians with Z. Just like this is showing you that they don't have A or B haplogroup or anything anymore. Those have V88, along with a large component of the others that have E1b. If you look up Acellar, man, you'll find that's the earliest known, and it can't go back farther than that because they have ones before the date of 4400 BC. Giving that, you can find that before that point, like Iwalira and others, they were a small, 4 foot tall, football headed, small brain, still Homo erectus form, living on in the Congo, you know, kind of like the land of the lost, or like we thought of when you see King Kong and there's this island that still had dinosaurs on it, and these concepts like that. But if you find a haplogroup that is known Caucasoid, Caucasian people, in those people, it shows you a huge amount of integration. And let me explain it easily and say this doesn't happen because of a one-time thing. Let's continue.
It has been present in Africa since prehistoric times, as attested by the following study, and was there even prior to its spread to Western Europe, where it is today the most common.
Yeah, but here in his own line, it shows you that it was from a back to Africa migration during prehistoric times of these Caucasian Aryan type people that had this going on. At least 17% of the population they talk about right here, and our findings do not support the previous hypothesized movement of Chadic speaking from the north across the Sahara as explanation for these R1b lineages in Central West Africa. In fact, the truth is this has worked the other way totally. They don't get to have something that's right down the middle line of E, RR1, and not be integrated on by the people that heralded those haplogroups.
2000, Oslin's first and most significant error relates to the haplogroup found in Tutankhamun. It is not O1A, but O1B. The first...
Now, he's thinking that he's really showing something here that's important. Well, R1A and B and a few others are connected to these ancient Aryans from around the Black Sea and the Caucasus region. And then we know, due to Anglo-Saxons and all the things that happened, that would have connected over into Western Europe. But lo and behold, it seems like it was all over the place. Again, I ask you to look up my video that I did just last week showing you that they expand all the way into where we call China today, down into the Indo-Pacific area, even in Australia and everywhere, even South America, and it's showing there.
First time I watched this TikTok video, I almost lost my mind.
Yes, blacks lose their mind whenever they realize that they weren't part of any of these civilizations, like they're trying to jealously claim, and then they want to act like, I'm going to get mad, I'm going to lose my mind, I'm going to whatever. Well, did you ever have a mind that was worth listening to? Because if you're trying to spout off jealous lies and everybody sees it, everybody does this faceplant idea and shakes their head.
I couldn't understand how such a lie was able to spread. This information is readily available everywhere, making it nearly impossible to miss.
Yep, so they show you R1b originated in Western Asia and makes up 50% of the genetic pool of modern Europeans, and it gets stronger to an 80%, almost a total swath on it here. The younger lady, his grandmother, Queen Tai, the great-grandmother of Thuya, which if you look up these people, they've got blonde hair and so on. You can look up hair in Wiki and you'll find that, go down to curly, what are you looking at? Well, I'm gonna look at some type of afro. No, that's way beyond curly, bro. Whenever they show curly, they show a lady who had natural blonde hair and it still contains her scalp up under the wig that was done in dark hair. You see, because they clearly stated out they rule over the dark-haired people. Were any of these blacks? Well, distinctly from up in Kush and so on, but they were talking themselves of the ancient Egyptians and a Mediterranean type, which are again also Caucasians. They have nothing to do with that. Now, they want to mention soy Kita analyzed sheeeeit short tandem loci, SDR. This is the same mistake whenever they don't check enough of these